All right, so shutter speed. Shutter speed affects, it's the amount of time that the camera allows the sensor to be exposed. And the standard shutter speeds, at least according to what I researched on Wikipedia, is 1/1000th of a second, 1/500th of a second, 1/250th of a second, 1/125th of a second, 1/60th of a second, 1/30th of a second, 1/15th of a second, an eighth of a second, a quarter of a second, half a second, and 1 second. Now, why that's important, why these standard shutter speeds are important, is because each shutter speed represents a full stop in light. And as I was mentioning before, those f-stops, so if you know that you need one more stop of sensitivity to get the image properly exposed, then it gives you options. You can slow your shutter speed down if you have that flexibility, if it's not gonna, it's okay with the situation. Because what'll happen is, if you look at these images below here, or this image on the left, it's cycling through the effect that shutter speed has on an image. And as you can see, this is 1/3 of a second, 1/30th of a second, 1/200th of a second, 1/800th of a second, and then back to 1/200th, 1/30th, 1/3, and 1 second. So what you're seeing is the amount of motion blur. And sometimes you want some motion blur, and other times you don't. You want it to be like a more of a crisp image. And so just kind of keep that in mind, in like, how do you want that image to look? Do you want it to look more crisp, or do you want it to have that more fluid motion? Now, there is a term or an effect or a standard that cinematic cameras have achieved, I think, for a very long time. And basically what it is, it's a 180-degree shutter angle. And how that breaks down is that you want, at the minimum, to have your image, the shutter speed, to be half the frame rate. Okay, so remember, frame rate is it's how many frames per second, right? So let's say you're shooting at 24 frames per second. If you want to expose your image for half that amount of time, so each frame represents 1/24th of a second. Do you follow me? So if we split that in half, if you go back to your old school math, your arithmetic, 1/2 times 1/24th becomes 1/48, right? Because you're multiplying the bottom parts of the fraction. So the closest thing that we have on this DSLR is not 1/48th, we have 1/50th, right? So to get the 180-degree shutter angle, or at least to replicate the look of the 180-degree shutter angle, you want to, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you set your shutter speed to 1/50th of a second. If you're shooting at 2997 frames per second, or 30 frames per second, so what's half of that, right? 1/2 times 1/60th is, I'm sorry, I gave you the answer. 1/2 times 1/30th is 1/60th. So if you're shooting 2997 and you want that 180-degree shutter angle look, then set your shutter speed to 1/60th. Now, for me, I actually I like my images to have a little bit more of the crisper look, so I will actually set my cameras at 24 frames per second, and I'll set the shutter speed, if I can, to at least 1/80th of a second. Now, that's a personal preference. You guys can do whatever you want, or whatever the situation needs. Sometimes you you'll sacrifice that kind of crisp look to just get enough light into the camera. So Canon cameras will let you go as slow as 1/30th of a second, and sometimes that's enough to give you that. It's one extra stop of light, so it's enough to get you the proper exposure if you're like indoors in a dark room or something, and ISO is maxed out and you need just a little bit more light to get in there. Sometimes it'll go down to 1/30th. One more thing I want to talk about for shutter speed and shutter in general is a term called rolling shutter. And I have put in an image here of a very extreme example of rolling shutter that I found on the web. Basically what happens, the way these DSLRs expose an image is that it will expose an image line by line from the top down. And it's doing it extremely fast, like, fractions of a second, right? One frame every 1/24th of a second, right? Or faster. And so what happens though, when you're scanning from top to bottom, if there's something moving in the frame, vertical lines may start to skew, because imagine if it's going through like a period of time and then this thing's scanning down and it's moving across, that single frame then starts to get diagonal. And you can see in this very extreme example, when these two cars are passing each other, that it got skewed a lot, right? There are a couple of ways that avoid that. Unfortunately, in DSLRs, it's sort of one of the cons that comes with the DSLRs, because the shutter mechanism in DSLRs are electronic, and it's doing it by how it's scanned on the sensor. In higher end cameras, like the Red camera, for example, it has a global shutter, and instead of it scanning one line at a time from the top down, it's exposing the whole sensor at all at once, and then it avoids that rolling shutter, that top-down shutter effect. Or even higher end cameras or film cameras, traditional film cameras that take film for motion picture, have a mechanical shutter, and that mechanical shutter, depending on how it's built, it may spin around, and then it exposes and closes the film gate to light. But just keep that in mind. If you're seeing kind of that skewing action, then there's not much you can really do about it. And that's what I have on exposure, or for shutter speed. If you guys have any questions, let me know. Hit us up in the comments, and again, we'll try and help.